Well, welcome everyone to a good place where truth and integrity meet. Every week, I introduce you to thought-provoking and compelling premier educators, politicians, whistleblowers, best-selling authors, journalists, activists, and celebrities. And they all have one thing in common. They are people of truth and integrity, and many are considered modern-day heroes. With me today is one of the most relevant guests of our current times, and that's Mr. Piers Robinson. He's the co-director of Organizations for Propaganda Studies and is an expert in much of what is happening today in America and across the world. We're here to discuss propaganda and how it currently influences us today, historically, and the history and inception of these powerful tactics that have been put into place to control people and even entire nations. So welcome to the interview.
Hello, I'm pleased to be with you.
Great. And so would you mind sharing for our listeners information pertaining to your work history and positions related to our topics? Like, I understand you're the co-director for Organizations for Propaganda Studies. And so what is your organization all about?
Well, the Organization for Propaganda Studies is an organization that we set up about 3 or 4 years ago when I was at University of Sheffield. And the aim of the organization was to really encourage and facilitate inquiry by academics into the question of propaganda in contemporary society. My background is, I'm an academic. I've worked at several British universities as a professor at Sheffield before leaving and then focusing on the Organization for Propaganda Studies. And my academic background is the intersection between international politics and conflict and communications and media. So my early academic work was on this idea of the CNN effect, this idea of the media driving policy, foreign policy decisions and driving interventions in places such as Somalia and Bosnia. And then really through my academic career, my interest in the question of propaganda grew and grew, whereas I was in early years, I was looking very much at this question of the interaction between media and foreign policy. I then became much more interested in propaganda and how information is manipulated and distorted even before it gets to the mainstream media. And I think it was the Iraq 2003 invasion and the question over intelligence manipulation. I focused on that in about 2011, 2012. And at that point, I really developed a keen awareness of really quite how extensive propaganda was, even in democracies. And that led me really down the road. And then the Organization for Propaganda Studies was formed. And really, because a lot of people in academia, certainly in mainstream academia, pay insufficient attention to propaganda. It's almost as though it's not quite taboo, certainly not today, but sort of up until 5 years ago, it was an area that was seen as not particularly relevant to liberal democracies, that propaganda was something that you'd find historically in wartime, or it's something you'd find in non-democratic states and authoritarian states, etc. But it hasn't been seen as something which is integral to Western democracies. So really the OPS was there to try to sort of, put a signal out to other academics and say, well, look, actually, we really need to start looking at the role of propaganda in democracies because it's very extensive. It's been excluded from our field of view as scholars. And that was really the idea behind it. And at the moment, it continues to be a fledgling organization. I've been very involved in a number of projects. And so it's really something which is still in its early stages. But we got some good material on the website, and we intend to sort of develop it further as the years go by.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things, I just wanted to talk about the word itself, propaganda. And the definition of propaganda, according to Merriam-Webster dictionary, it's number one, capitalize, a congregation of the Roman Curia have jurisdiction over missionary territories and related institutions. And from what I understand from my deep research is that the first time it was used in 1668, and it was related to religion. It was first referenced in the Catholic churches. And then number two, the spreading of ideas, information, or rumor for the purpose of helping or injuring an institution, a cause, or a person. And number three, ideas, facts, facts or allegations spread deliberately to further one's cause or to damage an opposing cause. Also, public action should have an effect. So I thought that was very interesting. And the word propaganda is related to the word propagate, and that means
Yes.
to share and to disseminate. And that's basically what it is. And in most cases, more often than not, propaganda is negative. It's negatively affecting people. It's disseminating lies, misinformation, disinformation to confuse people and to lead them astray, or to get on board with a political party or person, done so carefully and tactfully through misinformation and disinformation. Here in America, there's a lot of focus on QAnon, which is 100% propaganda. And I think most people are figuring it out. If someone still is a Q follower, then you might want to think about the fact that they've made all these promises and all these revelations and all these people are going to get arrested. None of that manifested. Right there, that should cause a person to become more skeptical. But unfortunately, when you're the propaganda as far as Q goes, it was so skillfully done. From what I understand, Cohen Watnick, who worked with Trump, was in charge or actually became associated with an intel group in Israel, and it was called Psycorp. And you could look it up. It says it's no longer in business, but it is. And it's just, it's when I read their manual, I got my hands on a manual and some emails. I actually have quite extensive documentation on this. It's almost frightening what they do. They want to disarm people, and that's one of the things they do. And they also try to bait people. Like the whole thing about QAnon is, oh, save the children. So, that brings in the women. And then they went after the spiritual communities and baited them as well. Like, oh, we're going to change the world and make it a better place to live. And there's still a lot of people that are still a little bit set in their ways. They just don't want to give up because it's triggered emotions. And when you're emotional, you're not thinking clearly. Your critical thinking is kind of aside. And certain cultures are just very committed to their beliefs and maybe just aren't willing to evaluate their own belief system. And so, of course, you're probably familiar with what happened on January 6th, and that all really correlates and was stemmed from QAnon, this entity that has occurred. And there's so many players involved. I mean, there's a Thomas Schoenberger, this man named Watkins, who was involved with helping promote it. And then you have the 4chan, which then they turned it over to 8chun, which became 8chan. So there's so many players involved, and working with the Russians, working with Israel, and it just perpetuated in a way that I've never seen before in my lifetime as far as propaganda goes.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting where you started and where the term propaganda comes from, and you're correct. It's a term which the Catholic Church coined, and is about propagating the faith. It was simply about trying to persuade and influence, and that was it had a neutral or a positive connotation at that point. And it's only sort of really in the 20th century, I think after the First World War, you start to see a negative inflection to the term propaganda. So, in early 20th century, it was actually seen, certainly by a lot of political theorists such as Lasswell and Walter Lippmann, propaganda was seen as a necessary part of managing democracy and so on. And then really sort of throughout, from the 40s, 50s onwards, the term started to become used in a very negative way, that propaganda was seen as you described, as something which was manipulative. It was something which was trying to get people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise want to do. I think, to me, the fundamental question of what propaganda is, and I think some scholars do talk about propaganda as any form of persuasion, but I don't buy that myself. I think that there's a distinction between persuading people in a way which is honest and straightforward, and free of, for example, any kind of coercion or deception or incentivization. The difference between that kind of persuasion or propagating ideas and propaganda, where you're actually manipulating people and you might manipulate people through disinformation, through deception, or you might coerce people, you might make people more scared of something than they actually should be, or you might incentivize people. But in that way, you're manipulating people, you're getting people, you're getting groups of people to believe and act in certain ways. And it's essentially non-consensual, it's not democratic. People are being pushed, cajoled, or deceived. And I think that's an important distinction to keep in mind with propaganda, this difference between persuading in a way which is, you know, reasonably democratic and is open and honest, because I think one can do that in political issues and in all kinds of issues. And then when you slip into propaganda, where you're manipulating. The problem is, and picking up on what we were talking about in relation to this example of QAnon in America, I mean, what we have in Western societies is for a long time is a very significant and very extensive what came to be called public relations. And of course, public relations was a term that, as Eddie Bernays famously described, was used to replace the term propaganda, because propaganda got a bad name, so they came up with public relations, a council for public relations. And these tools of manipulation that you see in the early part of the 20th century, they didn't disappear. It got renamed as public relations. But all of those tools and techniques have intensified, I think, across the course of the 20th century. And then what we have today with some of the phenomena that you're talking about is with the internet and with the kind of interconnectivity you have with the internet, but also, you know, potentially the way you can target and then sort of target information to select people and manipulate information in the digital realm, the potential for propagandizing people, the potential, as you described, for manipulating people's sort of fears and emotions and so on, I think is unprecedented. And I think we are at a point now where it's the level of manipulation is at unprecedented levels, and I do think that the internet technology we have enable that, and I think as we've lost trust in the mainstream media, and as we've lost trust, for example, in institutions such as academia to a large extent, these are sort of traditionally, you know, are meant to have been independent institutions which relied upon an accurate disseminators of information. And that's been lost. I mean, the mainstream media for a long time has been criticized for being too closely located to power and money and so on. The same goes for academia. And so as we've lost those institutions, people sort of are now in this internet sea, an internet environment where it becomes, I think, you know, challenging for them to distinguish between what's good and bad information, and also provides this very sort of open, blank slate for powerful actors to exploit this technology in order to modify beliefs and modify behavior. And, you know, we're in a very difficult phase, I think, because of those things. There's potential and there's positive potentials in this, in the sense that things like the internet do give the ability for people to seek out alternative information and so on. And, you know, there was this kind of golden era, I think, of the internet in, you know, the 90s and then in the early noughties, where you see this kind of sort of potential and independent media, alternative media. But sort of powerful actors have, I think, very much moved back to trying to sort of regain control using this technology. And now, you know, we are where we are, and as you described, that there are propaganda campaigns which are very extensive. And in my own area of looking at international politics and conflict, you know, it's always difficult to draw parallels back to Vietnam and so on. But if you look at the war on terror and you look at the conflicts that the West has been instigating over the last 20 years, there's been a remarkable inability to actually sort of mobilize either an anti-war movement or properly to actually start to try to end those wars in a way that, say, if you go back to
Can you be more
Vietnam.
specific about which wars we're referring to?
Yes, I mean, we're looking at sort of, post 9/11, we have Afghanistan, Iraq, and those wars, of course, continue to this day. And then you have Libya, Syria, and Yemen are currently major sites of conflict, which the West is directly involved in. And of course,
Iran.
you have, yes, you have this continual sort of drive from certain elements to go for Iran. And this has been a feature of the geopolitical landscape for the last 20 years, have been these wars. And they're major wars and very long running conflicts now. And they are being driven from the West. There's no doubt about that. Now, my point was that in earlier years, in earlier major conflicts such as Vietnam, there was a point in the Vietnam War where the American mainstream media started to really question what was going on, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And there was a point, and you had the anti-war movement, and you had some real truth-telling starting to emerge, I think, in that war. And it's difficult to see that over the last 20 years with the wars which have been fought under the aegis of the war on terror, that although these wars have gone on, and even though, for example, awareness over deception has increased, and of course the obvious example is Iraq and weapons of mass destruction, there seems to be very limited resistance to these wars. And here we are 20 years on, and of course Biden administration has come in. And Syria was bombed, was it a week or so ago, and the pressure seems to be ratcheting up on Iran. I mean, my position would be it's quite remarkable how persistent these wars have been and how difficult it has been to actually mobilize awareness of what's been going on. And I think one of the reasons is that the mainstream media has become more and more weakened certainly over the last 20 years, but also the internet environment and the ability to manipulate using those technologies has I think given more power to, for example, in the context of conflict, to the war machine, to people who promote war. And I'll give you a little example of this. Is that,
Because
I mean,
war is a money-making business.
well, it's a money-making business, and the military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower warned the Americans about when he was stepping down. When in the last 5 or 6 years, I started to research Syria, and one of the first things I noticed when I started to look and talk about the war in Syria, having really sort of started looking from about 2015, was the speed and rapidity with which I started to be attacked over social media to quite an extraordinary level, sort of asking some fairly benign questions about what was actually going on in that conflict. And I would find that people were attacking me on Twitter. I would find that some people were going into chat rooms on Facebook and trying to smear me to other colleagues of mine in my
Oh, it's
department.
horrible.
And so
Anybody who does this work, yeah.
yeah, this technology enables that, you see, of course. It enables this ability to start, you have trolls on Twitter, for example, and it does enable
But don't
this.
forget there's algorithms too.
Well, yes, and
Algorithms, they're not like bots. They're not even people attacking you.
exactly. There's that. Absolutely. There's that side of the technology as well. And time again, I find this, and certainly found it in the case with Syria. It certainly is, it's happened historically to anyone asking any sort of mild questions about 9/11, for example. And of course, you see the same pattern with COVID-19 and the issues surrounding scientists who have questioned some of the dominant policies. They get smeared and trolled. They don't get engaged with rationally, sort of let's sit down and argue. They just get attacked. And this technology enables it. And we almost seem to be in a phase now where it's almost like a playground, a playground full of very badly behaved kids who hurl abuse whenever anybody asks questions which go against power, or ask questions which challenge state power, or challenge perhaps a legal activity which is going on. You get abused, and that's a pretty intimidating, I think,
And
for a lot of
we can
people.
touch upon the COVID-19, but I did want to also go back a little bit and talk about alternative news, with Trump stating just about every day, fake news, fake news, fake news, mostly just to discredit journalists, investigative journalists who were finding information about him. And I'm not saying I'm completely against Trump. There were things he did that I appreciated, especially because I have some mistrust around the government myself, but I think I have more trust in the government now than I did before. And I realize that, many people in the government, they're trying to help us. They truly are. And so a lot of people, yes, they went down, they went to alternative news with no discernment. And they basically believed everything that they read, not understanding that the newspapers we grew up on in the mainstream news is vetted and they can get sued. So they're very careful about the information that gets out there. Do they hold back on things that maybe we should know? Yes, of course. So there's got to be like a happy medium, but I can't believe how many people believe like the CNN anchor, what's his name, from New York, Gloria Vanderbilt's son. They were saying he grew up in a Satanist home. He was drinking blood. He was abused in the basement of one of the Vanderbilt homes. And he had to come on CNN mainstream news and clear all those rumors that were going on in QAnon. And he goes, first off, this picture of me in some torturous device never happened. That's not me. I never even went to that home. And he goes, and as far as thinking I'm a Satanist, because my mother had in the background a picture of the Madonna and a child, he just had to clear all that up because of all the Twitter and all the misinformation that was spreading online about him.
I mean, there's certainly, I mean, you have this issue of fake news and misinformation circulating, and those examples you gave, that's clearly one element of what you see in the fabric of the internet. I mean, I always return to the point that with mainstream media, for example, it's pretty well documented over a long period of time that it's the mainstream media, as we understand them, are very closely located to political and economic power. So that there's a real bias in what you get from
Of
there.
course.
And then, of course, this is the great thing about independent media, is then it can provide, sort of a space for alternative views, which is good. And then, of course, as you say, you then have this problem with sort of fake news and information, which is absolutely false. I mean, I would say that in the grand scheme of things, I think that the biggest problem, because the mainstream media even today still has a reach which is far in excess of alternative media. In a way, the biggest problem with propaganda lies with mainstream media and the way in which they are co-opted or become a part of major propaganda drives from powerful actors, government, businesses, and so on. And
Yes.
that's where you get most of the distortion. So you have problems in lots of areas, but that's always my view. That's where the big problem lies. And then you have some independent media do a great job, and
Yes.
so on. Others aren't so good, and is spreading misinformation very deliberately, and so on. I mean, in the mix of all of this, I mean, how you deal with this is I think the most important strategy is for us to try to develop is encouraging people to develop media literacy skills, encouraging people to, or helping people develop the ability to assess information, determine what appears, what is reliable, what is not reliable.
We have a break coming up, but
Yeah,
I love that idea. I just think that is something that should be required. Everyone is considered a journalist at this point. Everybody
yeah.
goes online and digs around and tries to find information. So what you're saying is so important, and that definitely needs to happen. Well, I think we just have a few more minutes, so I'll let you finish your thought there.
Yes, so this idea of, rather than trying to sort of censor or condemn fake news and try and go down a very sort of dangerous road, I think, of actually sort of closing down a site because it had some false information on. I mean, if we were doing that, we'd be a lot of the mainstream media would have been closed down a long time ago. Is allowing people to sift through this information and evaluate what they think is strong and weak and so on. But having just learning the skills to actually sort of assimilate information. But the critical point also is encouraging people to have trust in their own judgment. I think that people have lost a lot of confidence over the years in their ability to use their own judgment, to use their own intelligence, and a lot of people, they want to follow.
We'll be right back, and that's And welcome back, everybody. I'm here with Piers Robinson, and we're talking about propaganda, something he's a specialist in. So before the break, we were just talking about people being educated to form their own opinions with a vast amount of available content online. So I'll let you pick up where we left off.
Yeah, so this idea that we don't want to go down the path where we censor and where we close down, and there is the drive for this at the moment, right? There's a drive to, with the kind of notion of a domestic war on terror in the US, that you need to start censoring. You need to stop people from saying things, that rather than going down that road, you improve the media literacy skills, you improve the confidence of people to trust in their own judgment, so they can sift through information, decide what looks, convincing or not convincing, and that's a much more productive road to go down. And I think in many ways, you give people those skills, you can trust them, you can trust their judgment. But more importantly, in a democracy, this is what a democracy and public debate is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about people working through a diversity of opinions, viewpoints, information, and then absorbing it and then reaching conclusions. This is a healthy part of a democracy. It's a healthy part of a good functioning public sphere. And this is what I think we've lost in many ways with what we have in the current, I think, panic over fake news, this panic over extremism and so on, and also this drive to deplatform and to censor people.
Yes.
There's an associated thing with this, is that the tolerance for different viewpoints seems to be shrinking. And so, you have the entire deplatforming issue, and people sort of whose views are not deemed to be acceptable are frozen out. And this is very authoritarian ultimately.
Yes, it is.
And it's very unhealthy because this is not how a healthy democracy functions. You need ideas to circulate, and you need people to have the self-control to respect other people's opinions, not
Well, that's
see other
difficult.
people.
The
Yeah, it is.
self-control
But
piece. I just
but
want to say real quick,
yeah.
in the United States, I think a good portion of the states, they feel more than they think. And that's
Mm,
kind of a problem. So this propaganda that we have here, it short circuits any critical thinking, using terms like save the children and you're the patriots, or, MAGA, all these different things. And they actually
mm,
have a name for it, for the QAnon. It's called PAC, and it's it stands for Person Affected by QAnon. So that's just something that we're really spending a lot of time on. And unfortunately, a lot of the topics they do discuss is important, but their voice is drowning out actual companies or actual organizations trying to help children because there's
mm,
been no arrests.
mm,
And I know they always tout, oh, we must save the children. There's been no arrest for child trafficking through QAnon. And I'm
mm.
sorry, I went off topic. Please return back to what you were
No,
saying.
that's okay. I mean, we are. I mean, I think that's an interesting point because I think that's one of the features of our contemporary propaganda environment is that slogans and ways of simplifying and appealing to emotion, these are techniques which are being applied, I think, extensively. And I don't think that, rational debate and discussion doesn't have to be emotion free. It's fine. And some people argue that part of rational argumentation has to include an emotional element. So there's
Mm-hmm.
nothing wrong with it being included, but it's when it comes to dominate. So you try to, for example, have a discussion about, say, the war in Syria, and if you deviate from the official line, you're immediately called an Assad apologist or a Putinist or a war crimes denier, which is I get
A
this all the time.
communist, even you get
Well,
accused of being a communist here.
in an earlier era, the McCarthy era, obviously, but smearing people through these labels and these simplistic terms is something which is easy to do in the internet environment, and I think sort of has gained a grip on people's minds, and it's really reduced. Maybe it's caused some of the problems that you've been talking about in relation to QAnon. I think that's one of the problems. The other thing we have, and you mentioned organizations, there are obviously organizations which are good and trying to do the right thing, but one of the, I think, things which we're starting to get a sense of in the 21st century is the way in which we have a multiplicity of organizations, and the question ultimately is how they're being funded and what's driving them. And I'm trying to think, I can think of a good example here, but we have many organizations and funding and support for people setting up grassroots movements, and sometimes they appear to be grassroots, but they're not really grassroots. They are being sort of directed and funded and so on. And there are so many organizations out there, and people look at one and they'll say, well, that's something I want to sign up to and I want to get on board with. It looks like they're trying to do a good thing. And it's not the case of all of them, but I think with a lot of them, people need to think, well, where's the funding coming for this organization? Where's the funding stream, etc.
You have to
And
say why to everything. I've
why?
taught my
And
daughter that. Hmm.
and actually, and again, so I will keep drawing upon this because it's been such a focus of my research in the last few years. But looking at the war on Syria, and you do have this pattern of NGO organizations which appear to be grassroots and independent, but they're not actually
Oh, really?
independent. Well, yes,
Share.
sort of. Well, the kind of controversial, but now documented example is the White Helmets operation in Syria, which is obviously presented as this first responder unit and so on, and they're there to save lives, etc. But they're an organization which has been funded and supported out of the governments who have been trying to overthrow the Syrian government,
Hmm.
and they to whatever extent they might be involved in those activities, there's also this kind of PR component to them, which is about sort of promoting essentially one side in the conflict, which is to decide, through the lens of opposition groups and then the governments who have been backing those groups to try to overthrow the Syrian government. So, the White Helmets appear to be independent, but they're not really independent when you look more closely and so on. And they are, there, as you said, you've got to ask that question, why? There's a reason why they're being funded by the French and the British and the Americans and so on, because it serves a useful purpose in that conflict. There's also other controversies which I won't go into in relation to that, but you see this, you see this frequently, and you see organisations which appear to be independent, but they're not neutral. They're not neutral, non-biased participants. And I think this is what we have. If you look out, you go onto the internet, you can see wide ranges of groups which are trying to do things, and some of them I'm sure are genuine and good. And then a lot of organizations are there pushing, trying to promote agendas, and there's a lot of money going into that and funding them.
Mm-hmm.
I
And
mean,
let's
and
not forget, like we had Trump had one of his in his cabinet, he had Rex Tillerson, and he owns, I believe it's Exxon.
mm,
And so there's always been this oil connection since the Bushes.
yes, yeah.
And
Well,
we all know that the Middle East is rich in oil, and they have this strange relationship with Saudis, which is this, the Saud. I don't know. It's like they're going after. There's this hate towards Iran, calling them the axis of evil. And I know journalists who I admire greatly, and that's just not the case. If anything, we should be siding with Iran or Iran, but we have this close relationship with the Saudis. I mean,
well,
they just chopped up one of the journalists to bits.
Well, I mean that's the geopolitics of the Middle East, and the West has for a long time. I mean, when I used to teach at university, I'd talk to students about the Iraq War, for example, and I'd say, well, go back and look at the Lawrence of Arabia. Britain's been fighting in the Middle East since the beginning of the 20th century. When the Iraq invasion occurred in 2003, and I think that there were British soldiers' graves in Iraq from sort of the early 20th century. We have been involved in the Middle East for a very long time, and I think you're correct to point out our allies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and so on, the Gulf states. I think it's reasonable to say these countries are arguably the least progressive relative to other countries in the Middle East.
I
But our
agree.
relationship with them is very much, as you say, it's rooted in oil. This is something which has been there for a very long time. And in many ways, it is at the heart of the conflicts that we've been
Yeah, I
seeing.
just went in to let I was referring to Khashoggi, the journalist Khashoggi. I didn't
Yes,
give his
yeah.
name, so go ahead.
Yes, and the reality of the last 20 years with the global war on terror. I did some work a number of years ago when it was called the Chilcot Inquiry, which is the inquiry into the British part role in the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And one of the really interesting things that the Chilcot report actually released were these conversations between Tony Blair and George Bush right after 9/11. And they're talking very openly about regime change wars, and they're talking about Iran, Syria, and Iraq, when to hit them. They actually use that term. And these are wars which are rolled out over the last 20 years, and it's a reasonably clear link between what we're seeing now and what you see in 2000, 2001 with the planning for a series of major conflicts in the Middle East. And those have primarily been about the West and its allies in the Middle East, the Gulf states, Israel, basically going up against what we perceive to be our opposition in the Middle East, Iraq, on the other side with China and Russia in the background, supporting Iran, Syria in various ways, and Iraq. It's a major, in a sense, superpower conflict, which has been driven by the West, and it's been a phenomenally destructive one. This is perhaps why I was talking earlier about this question of propaganda and war, why the media seems to have failed in a way even more so than it did in earlier eras, because this is the reality of the last 20 years. This has been war after war, and it's pretty well documented now that these things have been planned, and you can see it in the documents which have come out now through things such as the Chilcot inquiry. And it's still going on, and it could well be going on for another 10 years, and it could well end in war in Iran. And of course, it always runs the danger of ending in a more immediate confrontation with Russia or with China. in the Middle East, with
Some
two,
of those countries in Saudi and the Middle East are aligned with Russia and China, as we both
yes,
know.
yes, yes. Yes, exactly. I mean, this is why I describe it as this is that there are proxy wars in the Middle East, and you clearly have an alliance between China, Russia, and then Syria and Iran, and then you have the West with its traditional allies, the Gulf states, Israel. But the key point is that it's the Western powers which have been driving the conflicts, right? After 9/11, I mean, the move was into Afghanistan initially, but then it moved quickly to Iraq, and the Iraq invasion, as we know, was built upon misinformation about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. The
Oh,
neoconservatives
yes.
wanted to,
Yeah. They
and
showed
so
the bunker and there was nothing in it
yeah,
when the
and and
Americans
and
went down there. Yeah.
and the same goes, although sort of some point out you have the Arab Spring and then you have Libya and Syria and so on. I mean, that is one element of it, but it's quite clear that as soon as instability broke into unrest in those countries, then again, the West and its Gulf state allies have been supporting groups and extremist groups in some cases to try to overthrow those governments. And I mean, with Syria, you have, and it's well documented now, it's not a disputed, but you have Operation Timber Sycamore, a CIA operation in cooperation with Saudi Arabia to arm extremist groups in Syria. And you see that kicking off, I think, from 2012 onwards, some argue from slightly earlier. So you have the war machine, you mentioned earlier, has been driving these conflicts. And so I agree that there's an alliance and that there's a clear, there's Russia, China on one side and we're on the other side. But the empirical fact of the matter is that we and our allies have been fueling the conflict. These are not conflicts which have been primarily fueled by China or Russia or Iran. This has been an attempt. I think Condoleezza Rice spoke about this in 2005 about sort of notions of reordering the Middle East and so on. I've forgotten the exact phrase that she used. I know that one neocon said something along the lines of, you have to make an omelet, you've got to break a few eggs. But this is the reality of what's been, and it's been going on for a very long time, 20 years. Most of my academic sort of career has been witnessing these wars, and the wars carrying on, and they're tremendously destructive. If you look at the sort of even the most conservative estimates on death tolls arising from conflicts out of the war on terror, I mean, you're looking at millions of people who've been killed directly or indirectly. And that 1.3 million was a figure from 2009 by the International Physicians Against Nuclear Weapons Organization, and that figure is undoubtedly a lot higher now. These are huge conflicts, and were attended by terrible suffering, and it's been going on almost not out of the view of many people in the West, but after Iraq, there was obviously a lot of opposition to the Iraq invasion. But really, after that, the kind of awareness of what's been going on has shrunk. And I know certainly with the case with the war on Syria, I mean, I was not following it closely until about 2015, primarily because I was still too busy writing up work up from the Iraq invasion stage. But I was very conscious that there was a narrative that it was a civil war, is purely a civil war between democratic opposition and an authoritarian government. And then I think it's about 2015 I started to become much more aware that, wait a minute, we've got the French and the British and the Americans are actually supporting the opposition groups. And then more information came out about Operation Timber Sycamore and so on with the Saudis. And then it became very, very apparent that the war was one that was very much being fueled and driven from, Qatar, Israel was involved, Saudi Arabia, but the West as well. The war machine trying to destroy, as it had done with Iraq, and with probably the end goal in sight of being Iran.
It's kind of sad. There's a good portion of America that they couldn't tell you a single country. Like they are so unfamiliar with Saudi Arabia. I mean, they don't really learn much about them. I mean, in the United States, we're so American centric with our educational system, so it's very difficult to even feign
Mm,
interest. I mean, to get my daughter interested in it, and in certain parts, I remember in the South, they just called them towel heads. They're just all a bunch of towel heads from the Middle East.
right,
They can't tell you who, what, when, where, and all the various groups, which is so heartbreaking. And of course, America is such a huge country, so it's diverse, and you'll find different opinions and
yeah.
more educated groups of people, more thoughtful, reasonable people.
But this is what you say is very interesting, because this is the kind of one of the questions because I have an open mind about, how good is the internet, how good is alternative media, do we know more or less because of all of this? I mean, but I always go back to the point that we have a huge problem with propaganda and being steered in particular directions. But that basic idea of people having a good understanding of what's going on, it worries me that sort of after 20 years of the global war on terror, that what you just described, that people don't really understand what's going on, that problem is significantly worse than, say, it was during the Vietnam War, where you had a lot of the same problems of the American public not really being aware of what was going on. But then at some point, an awareness did develop. There was a very substantial anti-war movement. There were, mainstream journalists. Walter Cronkite, famously during the Tet Offensive, sort of editorializing on his CBS broadcast, saying, we're stuck in the quagmire. We have to get out of Vietnam. You had quite powerful moments, and you had awareness, or you at least had some awareness. And I don't want to sugarcoat. I mean, American sort of collective understanding of the Vietnam War, I think, continues to be limited. But there was some awareness. But when you look at the conflicts in the Middle East and you see the scale of them and how far we are involved, it's amazing that the situation is as you describe it, that many people almost have no idea of what's
Mhm.
going on, and they have no idea of the scale of the conflicts. And so you think, well, we're not in an age of greater transparency, even with all the internet. We
I
almost
know.
seem to be in an age of even less awareness, more confusion, with even more actors being very, very clever at pushing us and at hooking us into particular causes and getting behind, particular campaigns, in a way that doesn't actually, which actually takes us further away from understanding what's going on, what the truth or reality of what's going on in the world. Sort of, I suppose the term dazed and confused. Are we in
Mhm.
an era where people are dazed and confused and susceptible, as you say, to even more susceptible now to propaganda, susceptible to people who are deliberately manipulating or playing upon your emotions and so on.
Taking you down those rabbit holes, as we say.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I try to remain positive with these things. I try to think that, well, there is a hope that people's understanding of because it's my area, looking at conflict and communications, that people's understanding of conflict will improve, and people's understanding of the West's role in fueling these conflicts will improve. But it's not clear that that's actually happening.
Yeah, I just encourage people out there to really take a look at what's going on in the Middle East with a full understanding. You need to care. I know a lot of people look, oh, I don't care. That's the Middle East, and they're our enemies, and people just don't have a desire. Where do you suggest people go to find more unbiased information? That's important for people to know.
Well, I think that I mean, there are two things here. There's always been a kind of excuse, which even political scientists give, is that, well, people have limited time. People need to go to a trusted news source, and, because, they have busy lives. And I understand that point. But we live in a time where we have, I think, a very dysfunctional democracies across the West, very dysfunctional academia, mainstream media, political establishment, and so on. Corruption, if you want to call it that, but it's very dysfunctional. But it's very, very important in that context, more so than if the system's working extremely well. It's very important for people to, in a sense, take responsibility. That although we have busy lives and people have a lot going on, people also have a responsibility to understand what's going on, to understand what's going on in the world. So it's almost sort of you have to, say as a parent, the things that you need to do to be a good parent. So sometimes you don't always enjoy doing all things, etc. But you have to do it. It's the same with democracy. People have to engage. People have to make the effort to also not rely upon the mainstream media.
Yeah, it's empowering to know information and to be able to give information that is kind of well researched, and it's empowering. And we are people in our country. We can create change. We can demand justice if we know enough.
Yes. People have power. And if people need to be open-minded, people need to not be trusting of, definitely not be trusting of the mainstream media. That doesn't mean you reject it, but you need to look at that information. You can then go and look at alternative information sites. You can read around. But most importantly, try to use your own judgment. I have great faith that a lot of people have the intelligence and the judgment to work out what is reliable and what is unreliable. You might not always get it right, but also as long as you keep an open mind. I think one has to actually take it upon oneself to make that effort, that you're not going to just sit down, say 40 years ago, somebody would sit down and read the New York Times and that would be their information for the day. People need to work harder than that in the environment we are today. People need to ask. The other thing is just to ask serious questions. If this is what I'm being told by CNN about this issue, well, am I convinced by what they're saying? And that kind of desire to interrogate and to question, and then really to work quite hard to read
We just have a
around,
minute left.
look for alternative information. It's tough, but as you say, it's also rewarding, but it's also necessary, right? In a democracy, we're not here to trust and believe our governments. We're here for our governments to justify themselves to us, and it's our responsibility as citizens to interrogate our governments, not just to believe them, but to interrogate them and say, well, if this is what you're claiming, demonstrate it, show us the evidence, and that kind of active, challenging citizenship.
Well, thank you so much, Piers. It's been a wonderful conversation. I'll see you guys on Monday, same time, place, on TFR, and I'm also going to be on Friday. Thank you, Piers, for a meaningful